The worst part wasn't even the words themselves, it was the way my mom said them, with that particular blend of disappointment and resignation that only mothers can master. "Honey, your cooking is just so bland and basic." She pushed the plate of my homemade pasta primavera away, barely touched, and reached for her phone to order Chinese takeout instead. "I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. That moment, sitting in my cramped Chicago apartment kitchen 3 years ago, would become the catalyst for everything that followed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I've been obsessed with food for as long as I can remember. Not eating it, though I certainly enjoyed that part, but creating it, understanding it, making it sing with flavors that could transport people to different worlds. At least, that's what I thought I was doing. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I was the kid who volunteered to help with Thanksgiving dinner, who watched Food Network religiously, and who spent my allowance on exotic spices from the International Market downtown. My mom, Linda Martinez, was a practical woman who viewed cooking as a necessary chore rather than an art form. Her repertoire consisted of about 15 reliable dishes that she rotated through on a schedule so rigid you could set your watch by it. Monday was always spaghetti with jarred sauce. Wednesday was baked chicken with steamed vegetables. Friday was pizza night, but only from Romano's down the street, never homemade. The irony wasn't lost on me that her favorite television show was Culinary Masters, a high-end cooking competition where renowned chefs battled it out with ingredients I could barely pronounce. She'd sit transfixed every Thursday night, analyzing techniques and critiquing presentations with the expertise of someone who'd never attempted anything more complex than boxed mac and cheese. "Look at how Chef Morrison layers those flavors," she'd say, gesturing at the screen. "That's real cooking. That's artistry." I absorbed every episode alongside her, taking mental notes and dreaming of the day I'd create something that would earn that same reverence. In high school, I started experimenting more boldly. I'd surprise the family with fusion dishes, Korean-inspired tacos, Mediterranean flatbreads with unexpected toppings, Indian-spiced pot roasts that filled the house with aromatic clouds. My dad, Robert, was always game to try whatever I put in front of him. He'd nod approvingly and ask for seconds, though I suspected his enthusiasm had more to do with not having to cook than with my actual culinary skills. My mom's reactions were more measured. She'd taste everything politely, offer a non-committal, interesting, and then quietly prepare herself a peanut butter sandwich an hour later. After high school, I enrolled at Portland Community College with plans to transfer to culinary school. But life had other ideas. Dad got laid off from the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 12 years, and suddenly my college fund became the family's emergency savings. I took a job at Bennigan's, a local diner that served exactly the kind of food my mom considered normal: burgers, fries, meatloaf, and pie. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me in the food industry. For 2 years, I flipped eggs and assembled sandwiches while watching YouTube cooking tutorials on my breaks. I practiced knife skills on restaurant prep vegetables and experimented with flavor combinations during slow shifts. The head cook, an older man named Earl who'd been at Bennigan's since the Carter administration, took me under his wing and taught me the fundamentals of volume cooking and cost control. "Fancy don't mean good," Earl would say, watching me julienne vegetables with the precision I'd learned from online videos. "But good always means something. You just gotta figure out what that something is for you." When I finally saved enough money to move to Chicago and attend the Kendall College of Culinary Arts, I thought I'd found my answer. The city's food scene was everything Portland wasn't: diverse, innovative, and unforgiving. My classmates came from all over the world, bringing techniques and perspectives that challenged everything I thought I knew about cooking. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I was the first one in the kitchen labs and the last to leave. I read cookbooks like novels and practiced mother sauces until I could make them blindfolded. My instructors praised my technical skills and work ethic, but something was missing. The feedback was always positive but never passionate. My dishes were well executed and properly seasoned, but never extraordinary or memorable. The doubt crept in slowly at first, then all at once. Maybe my mom was right. Maybe I was just going through the motions, creating food that checked all the technical boxes without actually saying anything meaningful. After graduation, I landed a position as a line cook at Meridian, an upscale contemporary American restaurant in River North. The executive chef, Marcus Thompson, was a James Beard Award nominee with a reputation for perfectionism that bordered on tyranny. Working under him was like attending a master class in both culinary excellence and psychological warfare. "Your risotto is competent," he'd say, tasting a spoonful with the expression of someone solving a particularly boring math problem. Competent and forgettable. The kitchen at Meridian was a pressure cooker of ambition and ego, where the weak were quickly weeded out and the strong learned to thrive under impossible conditions. I survived, even excelled in some ways, but that nagging voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like my mother, kept whispering that I was a fraud. That beneath all the technical training and expensive knife skills lay the same bland, basic cook who couldn't even make pasta primavera interesting enough to finish. The breaking point came on a busy Saturday night in October. I'd been at Meridian for 8 months, long enough to earn a small promotion to sauce station, when Chef Thompson decided to let me create a special for the weekend menu. It was my chance to finally showcase something personal. Something that went beyond textbook technique. I spent days developing the dish, pan-seared duck breast with cherry gastrique, roasted fingerling potatoes, and braised rainbow chard. It was technically flawless, beautifully plated, and utterly predictable. The kind of dish you'd find at any upscale restaurant in any major city. It sold well that weekend, earning polite compliments from servers and customers alike. But when I called my parents to share the news of my first original menu item, my mom's response was the same lukewarm enthusiasm I'd grown accustomed to. "That sounds lovely, honey. Very restaurant-y. Restaurant-y. Not inspired, not creative, not even particularly good, just restaurant-y." That night, after service, I sat alone in my studio apartment with a container of leftover duck and a growing certainty that I was wasting everyone's time, including my own. I'd spent years and thousands of dollars learning to cook food that could have been created by any competent chef with access to the same ingredients and techniques. The next morning, I gave my notice at Meridian. Chef Thompson was surprisingly understanding, or maybe just relieved to have one less mediocre cook cluttering up his kitchen. "You've got solid fundamentals, Martinez," he said, not looking up from his prep list. "Maybe you just need to figure out what you're actually trying to say." What I was trying to say, as if cooking were a language and I'd been speaking it with a stutter my entire life. I spent the next few months working at a casual Italian place in Lincoln Park, earning barely enough to cover rent while I figured out my next move. It was there, making the same marinara sauce for the 100th time, that I started to understand what Earl had meant about finding my something. The revelation didn't come all at once. It started with small experiments, adding a touch of smoked paprika to the house Caesar dressing, incorporating miso paste into the bolognese for depth, finishing the garlic bread with a drizzle of chili, oil that I made myself. Nothing revolutionary, just tiny adjustments that made familiar dishes feel slightly more alive. The customers noticed. Not dramatically, but enough to ask questions. "What's different about Caesar tonight? This bolognese tastes richer somehow." The other cooks started asking for my versions of the recipes, curious about the small changes that seemed to make such a big difference. I realized I'd been approaching cooking like a student trying to pass a test, following rules, hitting marks, avoiding mistakes. But food isn't a test, it's a conversation, and I'd been too afraid to speak up, too worried about saying the wrong thing to say anything meaningful at all. That's when I decided to take the biggest risk of my culinary career. Instead of looking for another line cook position at another restaurant where I'd be executing someone else's vision, I was going to create my own place. Something small, intimate, and entirely mine. The idea terrified me. I had no business experience, limited savings, and a track record of creating technically sound but ultimately forgettable food. But for the first time in years, I felt something that had been missing throughout my entire culinary education: genuine excitement about cooking. Finding the right space turned out to be harder than finding my culinary voice. Chicago's restaurant. Real estate market was brutal, especially for someone with my limited budget and non-existent credit history as a business owner. I spent 3 months touring cramped basements, former dry cleaners, and spaces so small they made airplane galleys look spacious. The breakthrough came through pure luck and a conversation with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who ran a small grocery store in Pilsen. I'd been shopping there for months, drawn by her incredible selection of Asian ingredients and her willingness to explain how to use items I'd never encountered. One afternoon, while I was debating between 3 different types of soy sauce, she mentioned that her nephew had been trying to rent out a small storefront he owned in the neighborhood. "It used to be a bakery," she said in her careful English. "Good bones, but needs work. He asks too much money, but maybe for you." She shrugged with the universal gesture of someone willing to make introductions. Space was a disaster. 2,400 square feet of peeling paint, broken fixtures, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. But it had something that all the other places I'd seen lacked: character. High ceilings, with original tin work, brick walls that had been painted over so many times they looked like geological formations, and windows that faced west, filling the space with golden light every afternoon. Tommy Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, was a soft-spoken accountant who'd inherited the building from his father and had no idea what to do with it. The previous tenant, a Polish bakery called Kowalski's, had been there for 30 years before the owners retired and moved to Florida. Tommy had been asking for $3,000 a month, which was laughable for someone in my financial situation, but Mrs. Chen had apparently worked some magic. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. "She says you cook good food," he told me during our walkthrough. "She also says you work hard and don't make trouble. That's worth something." We settled on $1,800 a month with a 6-month lease and an option to renew. It wasn't exactly a steal, but it was manageable if I could make the numbers work. The catch was that I had to handle all the renovations myself. I spent the next 4 months transforming that wreck into something resembling a functional restaurant. My dad drove down from Portland with his truck full of tools, and together we rebuilt the kitchen from the ground up. We installed new gas lines, rewired the electrical system, and scrubbed decades of grease from every surface. My mom came too, ostensibly to help but mostly to provide a running commentary on everything I was doing wrong. "Are you sure this is a good neighborhood?" she asked, watching a group of teenagers skateboard past the windows. "And this kitchen is so small. How are you going to serve more than 10 people at once?" Her concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Pilsen was in transition, caught between its working-class Mexican roots and the encroaching gentrification that was slowly pushing out longtime residents. The restaurant scene was limited, mostly taquerias and family-owned spots that had been serving the same customers for decades. I was betting that the neighborhood's evolution would work in my favor, bringing new customers while respecting the community that was already there. The menu was the biggest challenge. I knew I wanted to create something that reflected my own culinary journey, techniques learned in fancy kitchens applied to ingredients and flavors that felt more honest and accessible. I spent weeks experimenting in my apartment, creating dishes that bridged the gap between my technical training and the comfort food that actually made people happy. The concept that emerged was new American comfort food with global influences. A pretentious way of saying I was going to make familiar dishes more interesting without making them intimidating. My signature dish became what I called Korean-style short rib grilled cheese. Tender braised short rib with kimchi and aged cheddar on house-made sourdough, served with a small cup of the braising liquid for dipping. It was comfort food that happened to be technically complex, the kind of dish that made people smile before they even tasted it. I also developed a rotating selection of what I called grandmother dishes, recipes inspired by the comfort foods of different cultures, but executed with restaurant-quality technique. There was a ramen carbonara that combined Japanese and Italian techniques, a tikka masala mac and cheese that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did, and a Vietnamese spiced pot roast that took everything I'd learned about braising and applied it to flavors I'd discovered during my late-night food truck adventures. The beverage program was intentionally simple, a carefully curated selection of wines that paired well with the food, local craft beers, and a handful of creative non-alcoholic options that I made myself. I wasn't trying to compete with the cocktail bars downtown. I wanted to create a place where the focus remained squarely on the food. Finding staff was another adventure entirely. I couldn't afford to hire experienced cooks, so I ended up with a motley crew of culinary school dropouts, ambitious servers looking to learn kitchen skills, and one dishwasher named Miguel who spoke limited English but had an intuitive understanding of kitchen flow that put most trained cooks to shame. My sous chef, if you could call him that, was a 22-year-old named Danny Walsh, who'd spent 2 years at various chain restaurants before deciding he wanted to learn real cooking. He was enthusiastic but inconsistent, capable of beautiful knife work one day and burning onions the next. What he lacked in experience, he made up for in willingness to work for almost nothing and an eagerness to learn that reminded me of myself at that age. The front of house was managed by Sarah Kim, a former theater major who'd been waiting tables at upscale restaurants for 3 years while auditioning for plays that never came. She had an instinctive understanding of hospitality that couldn't be taught, the ability to make every customer feel like they were the most important person in the room without seeming fake or overly familiar. We spent 2 weeks doing Friends and family services before the official opening, working out kinks in the kitchen timing and training the servers on the menu. The feedback was encouraging but not overwhelming. People liked the food, praised the atmosphere, and seemed genuinely excited about having a new option in the neighborhood, but there was nothing in their reactions that suggested we were creating anything truly special. The official opening was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, intentionally low-key to give us time to find our rhythm before word spread. I'd sent press releases to the local food blogs and weekly papers, but I wasn't expecting much coverage. Chicago's food scene was saturated with new openings, and a small neighborhood restaurant with an unknown chef wasn't exactly breaking news. We opened the doors at 5:30 p.m. to a dining room that was about half full, respectable for a Tuesday, especially considering we'd done virtually no marketing beyond a few social media posts and flyers in the surrounding blocks. The first few tables were friends and neighbors, people who'd been watching the renovation process and were curious to see what we'd created. The evening started well. Orders came in at a manageable pace, the kitchen found its rhythm, and the servers seemed comfortable with the menu. I was working the pass, checking every plate before it went to the dining room, when I noticed a woman sitting alone at table 6. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed but not flashy, and she was taking notes while she ate. My first thought was food blogger, but she didn't have the slightly performative quality that most food writers brought to their dining experiences. She seemed genuinely focused on the food itself, tasting each component separately before trying them together. She ordered 3 different dishes: the Korean short rib grilled cheese, the tikka masala mac and cheese, and a seasonal special I'd developed using local ingredients. She ate slowly, methodically, occasionally jotting down notes in a small leather notebook. After finishing her meal, she approached the pass and asked to speak with the chef. I wiped my hands on my apron and came around the counter, expecting either praise or constructive criticism. I'm Rebecca Santos from the Tribune, she said, extending her hand. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check out the new place. My heart stopped. The Chicago Tribune's food critic, unannounced, on our second day of service. This was either going to make my career or end it before it really began. I have to ask, she continued, where did the idea for the Korean short-rib grilled cheese come from? It's not what I expected, but it works beautifully. I found myself telling her about my journey, the years of cooking technically correct but uninspiring food, the realization that I'd been afraid to trust my own instincts, and the decision to build a menu around dishes that made me genuinely excited to cook. She listened intently, asking follow-up questions about my techniques and ingredient sourcing. The tikka masala mac and cheese is brilliant, she said. It shouldn't work, but you've balanced the spices perfectly. It tastes like comfort food, but thinks like fine dining. She left that night without giving any indication of what she might write, but her visit had an immediate effect on the kitchen. Word spread quickly through Chicago's tight-knit restaurant community that Rebecca Santos had been spotted at our place, and suddenly other industry people started showing up. Over the next few weeks, we began building a steady following. The Palm Beach neighborhood regulars were joined by food enthusiasts from other parts of the city, drawn by positive word of mouth and a few enthusiastic social media posts. We were busy enough to feel successful, but not so slammed that the quality suffered. The real test came when we decided to participate in Chicago Restaurant Week, a citywide promotion where restaurants offered special pre-fix menus to attract new customers. I created a 3-course menu that showcased our philosophy, elevated comfort food that felt approachable rather than precious. The response was overwhelming. We were booked solid for the entire week, with a waiting list that stretched for hours. More importantly, the customers weren't just showing up for the discount. They were engaging with the food, asking questions about ingredients and techniques, and many were making reservations to return at regular prices. One evening during Restaurant Week, I was expediting orders when I noticed a familiar figure being seated at table 12. My mom had flown in unannounced, supposedly to help with the increased business, but really to see for herself what I'd created. I watched nervously from the kitchen as she studied the menu, ordered the pre-fixed dinner, and settled in with the expression of someone prepared to be politely disappointed. She started with the butternut squash soup with brown butter and sage, a dish that seemed simple but required precise technique to achieve the right texture and balance. From the pass, I could see her face change as she tasted it. The polite smile was replaced by something that looked almost like surprise. She finished the entire bowl, something I'd rarely seen her do with any of my cooking. The second course was my interpretation of chicken and dumplings, slowly braised chicken, thighs with house-made pasta in a rich, herb-infused broth. Again, she cleaned the plate, even using her bread to soak up the remaining sauce. But it was the dessert that truly shocked me. I'd created a deconstructed apple pie, spiced apples, house-made vanilla ice cream, and crumbled oat streusel arranged on the plate like an abstract painting. It was playful but sophisticated, familiar but surprising. She ate every bite, then sat back in her chair with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just approval, but genuine amazement. She gestured for Sarah to come over and asked to speak with the chef. When I approached her table, she was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing something new. "Jessica," she said finally, "this isn't bland or basic at all." The conversation with my mom that night changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Instead of the tearful reconciliation I'd imagined, we sat there in the nearly empty dining room having the most honest discussion about food and each other that we'd ever had. "I need to tell you something," she said, fidgeting with her napkin. "I never criticized your cooking because it was bad. I criticized it because I was scared. This wasn't the direction I'd anticipated." "Scared of what? Of you being disappointed? Of you putting everything into something that might not work out?" She paused, looking around the restaurant that was clearly working out just fine. Your father lost his job when you were supposed to start culinary school. I watched him struggle with feeling like he'd failed, like he wasn't good enough. I didn't want that for you. The irony was staggering. In trying to protect me from failure, she'd nearly convinced me I was destined for mediocrity. But sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built, that conversation finally laid to rest the voice in my head that had been questioning every decision I made. She stayed for 3 more days, and I watched her discover the restaurant through fresh eyes. She helped during the breakfast prep, something I'd never expected to see, and I realized that her practical approach to cooking, the efficiency, the consistency, the focus on feeding people well, had actually taught me more than I'd given her credit for. I just needed to learn how to add my own voice to those fundamentals. The week after she left, Rebecca Santos's review appeared in the Tribune. I'd been dreading it, knowing that a negative review from Chicago's most influential food critic could kill a young restaurant before it had a chance to establish itself. Sarah texted me the link at 6 a.m., and I spent 10 minutes staring at my phone before I had the courage to open it. Hidden Gem in Pilsen serves comfort food with a conscience, read the headline, and my hands started shaking before I'd read a single word of the actual review. Santos had captured exactly what I'd been trying to achieve. Chef Martinez has created something genuinely special, a restaurant that honors both technique and heart. Her Korean short-rib grilled cheese sounds gimmicky on paper, but reveals itself as a masterclass in balancing flavors and textures. This is comfort food that doesn't apologize for being intelligent, cooking that respects both its ingredients and its diners. The review was 3 stars out of 4, with particular praise for the seamless integration of global influences into familiar formats, and the unpretentious atmosphere that lets the food speak for itself. She mentioned the small dining room, the personalized service, and the sense that every dish had been created by someone who genuinely cared about the experience of eating it. The phone started ringing before I'd finished reading the review. Reservations, interview requests, and congratulations from other chefs in the city. Within a week, we were booked solid for the next month, and I had to start a waiting list that stretched into the following season. Success brought its own challenges. The increased volume put strain on our small kitchen, and I realized that the systems that worked for 30 covers a night fell apart when we tried to push 50. I had to quickly hire 2 more cooks and restructure our prep schedule to handle the demand without compromising quality. More importantly, I had to learn how to manage a team under pressure. Danny, my sous chef, was struggling with the increased pace, making mistakes that had been acceptable when we were slower, but became dangerous when every table was full. I found myself torn between loyalty to someone who'd been with me from the beginning and the responsibility to maintain the standards that had earned us the recognition. The conversation I'd been avoiding came to a head on a particularly brutal Saturday night. We were an hour behind on tickets, the servers were getting frustrated, and I could see customers at table 7 checking their watches with the expression of people considering whether to just leave. Danny had overcooked 3 orders of the duck breast, our most expensive entree, and was starting to panic in the way that made everyone around him nervous. I pulled him aside during a brief lull and had the kind of honest conversation that no one enjoys, but everyone needs sometimes. I know you're working hard, I told him, but hard work isn't enough anymore. We need consistency, and right now, we're not getting it. To his credit, Danny didn't get defensive. He nodded, looked around the chaotic kitchen, and said something that surprised me. I think I'm holding you back. 2 weeks later, he gave his notice, but not in the way I'd expected. He'd enrolled in a more advanced culinary program and wanted to spend the summer at restaurants in New York before coming back to Chicago with skills that matched his ambition. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful career planning I wished I'd done at his age. His replacement came through a recommendation from Chef Thompson at Meridian. Elena Rodriguez had worked at several high-end restaurants in the city and was looking for a place where she could have more creative input. She was technically superior to Danny, but more importantly, she understood how to work efficiently under pressure without sacrificing attention to detail. Elena's arrival marked the beginning of what I started thinking of as our second phase. With a more experienced team in the kitchen, I could focus on developing new dishes and refining our operations instead of constantly putting out fires. We introduced a chef's tasting menu that changed monthly, giving me a chance to experiment with more complex preparations while keeping the core menu accessible. The tasting menu became a showcase for everything I'd learned about balancing innovation with approachability. One memorable iteration included a play on childhood lunch foods, an elevated peanut butter and jelly that used house-made brioche, locally sourced strawberry preserves, and a peanut butter mousse that had been aged with brown butter. It was silly and sophisticated at the same time, the kind of dish that made people laugh before making them think. Food bloggers and Instagram influencers started discovering us, which brought a different kind of customer, younger, more social media savvy, and focused on dishes that photographed well. I had mixed feelings about this development, but Sarah convinced me that visibility was ultimately good for business, even if some of the new customers seemed more interested in posting pictures than actually tasting the food. The real validation came from other chefs. On slow Tuesday nights, I'd often see familiar faces from the city's most respected restaurants, industry people who could eat anywhere but chose to spend their nights off at our small corner spot in Pilsen. They'd order off-menu items, ask about techniques, and engage with the food in a way that felt like professional respect rather than casual dining. One evening in late fall, I was working the line when Sarah appeared at the pass with an expression that meant either very good news or complete disaster. "There are 2 people here who want to talk to you," she said. "They say they're from a television show." My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but Sarah's expression suggested otherwise. I cleaned my hands, adjusted my apron, and followed her to table 15, where 2 professionally dressed people were finishing their meals with the methodical attention of people who ate for a living. The woman introduced herself as Kate Morrison, a producer for Culinary Masters, my mom's favorite show and one of the most respected cooking competitions on television. The man was David Chen, the show's talent coordinator, and they'd been following the Chicago food scene for potential contestants. "We've been hearing your name a lot lately," Kate said. "Rebecca Santos's review, recommendations from other chefs, and tonight's meal certainly lived up to the reputation." They explained that the show was casting for a new season focused on rising stars, established chefs who hadn't yet achieved national recognition but demonstrated exceptional creativity and technical skill. They thought I might be a good fit. For the competition, the opportunity was flattering but terrifying. Culinary Masters was known for its brutal challenges and high-pressure environment. Contestants had to create restaurant-quality dishes under impossible time constraints while dealing with mystery ingredients, equipment failures, and the psychological pressure of cameras recording their every mistake. "We're not asking for an answer tonight," David said, "but we'd like you to consider it. The show could be transformative for your career." After they left, I spent the rest of the evening in a daze, mechanically plating dishes while my mind raced through the implications. The show could bring national exposure that would change everything. More customers, cookbook deals, expansion, opportunities. It could also be a spectacular failure broadcasted to millions of viewers. I called my parents that night, expecting my mom to be thrilled about the connection to her favorite show. Instead, she was surprisingly cautious. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of attention?" she asked. "You've built something beautiful there. Sometimes it's better to focus on what you have than to chase what you might get." It was wise advice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been preparing for my entire career. Every technique I'd learned, every failure I'd overcome, every dish I'd perfected had been leading to moments like this, chances to prove that I belonged among the best chefs in the country. The decision became easier when I thought about what the restaurant had already accomplished. We'd established ourselves as a neighborhood institution while earning respect from the broader culinary community. Our staff was solid, our systems were working, and our reputation could withstand a temporary absence if I chose to compete. More importantly, I realized that my relationship with cooking had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the insecure line cook who questioned every decision. I'd found my voice, developed my style, and proven, at least to myself, that I could create food that mattered to people. I called Kate Morrison the next morning and told her I was interested. The casting process was intensive, multiple interviews, cooking demonstrations, psychological evaluations, and background checks that seemed designed to uncover every embarrassing moment of my culinary education. They wanted to understand not just how I cooked, but why I cooked, what drove me to push through the inevitable failures that defined every chef's journey. The final callback was held at a studio kitchen in Los Angeles, where 20 potential contestants spent 2 days cooking under simulated competition conditions. We were given mystery baskets, time limits, and judges who critiqued our dishes with the kind of brutal honesty that television audiences expected. I prepared 3 dishes over the 2 days: a seafood risotto that showcased my technical skills, a reimagined comfort food dish that represented my restaurant's philosophy, and a dessert that pushed me outside my comfort zone. The feedback was mixed, which I took as a good sign. If they'd loved everything, I wouldn't have been challenged enough. If they'd hated everything, I wouldn't have belonged there. 2 weeks later, Kate called with the news that I'd been selected for the new season. Filming would begin in 3 months, which gave me time to prepare the restaurant for my absence and mentally gear up for the most intense cooking competition on television. The night before I left for Los Angeles, the restaurant threw a small celebration. The staff, regular customers, and a few industry friends gathered for an informal dinner that felt more like a family gathering than a business event. Elena assured me that she and the team could maintain our standards while I was away, and Sarah promised to document everything so I wouldn't miss any important developments. My parents flew in for the send-off, and seeing my mom in the restaurant, she'd initially been skeptical about felt like completing a circle. She'd gone from questioning my choices to actively supporting them, and her presence that night reminded me how far we'd both come. As I looked around the dining room, at the exposed brick walls, the mismatched chairs we'd collected from estate sales, the open kitchen where you could watch your food being prepared with care, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had led to this moment. The scared line cook who'd quit Meridian 3 years earlier could never have imagined this scene, but that person had been necessary too, because without that failure, without that moment of admitting I'd been cooking without passion or purpose, none of this would have been possible. Tomorrow, I'd be competing against some of the most talented chefs in the country on national television. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. The Culinary Masters production facility in Culver City looked nothing like the sleek studio kitchens viewers saw on television. Behind the cameras were miles of cables, lighting rigs that generated enough heat to roast a turkey, and a small army of producers, cameramen, and assistants who moved with the choreographed precision of a pit crew. I arrived 3 days before. Filming began, part of a group of 12 chefs who'd been selected for what the producers called Rising Stars Edition. We were all between 28 and 35, all running our own kitchens or restaurants, and all terrified of making fools of ourselves on national television. The other contestants were impressive in the way that made me question what I was doing there. There was Marcus Kim from Seattle, whose modern Korean restaurant had been featured in Bon Appetit 6 months earlier. Ashley Thompson from Austin ran a farm-to-table concept that had been nominated for a James Beard Award. David Moreau had worked at Le Bernardin before opening his own seafood restaurant in Miami. These weren't rising stars. They were already established, already recognized by the industry in ways I could only dream about. My restaurant had been open for barely 2 years. I'd received exactly one major review, and my biggest claim to fame was serving elevated comfort food in a gentrifying neighborhood. The first day of filming was dedicated to what the producers called establishing shots, individual interviews where we talked about our backgrounds, our restaurants, and our motivation for competing. The questions seemed straightforward, but the cameras and bright lights made everything feel surreal. "Tell us about your restaurant," the interviewer prompted. "I opened Meridian Gardens 18 months ago in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood," I began, then immediately regretted the name confusion with my former workplace. The restaurant was actually called Crossroads, a name I'd chosen to reflect the intersection of techniques and cultures that defined my cooking. What makes your food unique? This was the question I'd been preparing for, but under the hot lights. With cameras rolling, my carefully practiced answer sounded rehearsed and hollow. I found myself talking about elevated comfort food and global influences in exactly the kind of pretentious language that would have made my past self cringe. The real interview happened during a break, when the cameras stopped rolling and the interviewer, a friendly woman named Jessica, asked more personal questions. "Why are you really here?" she said, offering me a bottle of water. "Honestly, to prove to myself that I belong at this level. I've spent my entire career feeling like I was one step behind everyone else, always catching up but never quite getting there." She nodded knowingly. That's the real story, the one viewers will connect with. When filming resumed, her questions were different, more probing, and I found myself telling the truth about my journey. The years of self-doubt, the mother who'd inadvertently convinced me I was mediocre, the moment I decided to stop playing. It's safe and start cooking with genuine passion. The first challenge was designed to level the playing field. We had to create a dish using only ingredients from a convenience store: chips, processed cheese, frozen vegetables, and other items that represented everything fine dining supposedly stood against. I wandered the mock convenience store, watching other contestants grab obvious combinations: nachos with elevated toppings, gourmet mac and cheese made with Velveeta, instant ramen transformed with technique. The challenge wasn't really about the ingredients. It was about creativity under constraints and the ability to make something memorable from the mundane. I settled on creating what I called gas station sushi, using potato chips as a crunchy element, processed cheese transformed into a sauce, through proper emulsification, and frozen vegetables that I'd pickle quickly with the vinegar available. It was absurd on paper but surprisingly elegant in execution. The judges, Chef Amanda Rodriguez, a James Beard winner from New York, Chef Michael Foster, who'd built an empire of successful restaurants, and Chef Sarah Kim, a television personality, known for her brutal honesty, tasted our dishes with expressions that revealed nothing. "Explain this dish," Chef Rodriguez said, poking at my creation with obvious skepticism. "It's inspired by the idea that innovation comes from limitation," I replied. I wanted to take ingredients that people associate with quick, mindless eating and show that with proper technique, you can create something that engages all your senses. Chef Foster took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and surprised me by nodding approvingly. "This actually works. The textures are interesting, the flavors are balanced, and you've managed to make processed cheese taste intentional." I survived the first elimination, but barely. Marcus Kim, the chef from Seattle, went home after creating a dish that was technically perfect, but completely soulless. Exactly the kind of mistake I'd been making for years before finding my voice. The second challenge was more traditional. Create a fine dining interpretation of a classic American dish. I chose chicken and waffles, partly because it played to my strengths in comfort food elevation, and partly because none of the other contestants seemed interested in tackling it. My version involved a perfectly cooked piece of heritage chicken, thigh, a savory waffle infused with herbs and cheese, a bourbon maple gastrique, and microgreens that I'd grown myself during our prep time. It was technically complex, but familiar enough to be approachable. The cooking went smoothly until the final plating, when I realized I'd been so focused on the individual components that I'd forgotten to consider how they worked together visually. With 2 minutes left, I had to completely reimagine the presentation, arranging elements on the plate in a way that told a cohesive story. The judges' critique was mixed. Chef Kim praised the flavor combinations and technical execution, but noted that the plating looked rushed. Chef Foster loved the concept and thought the bourbon gastrique was inspired. Chef Rodriguez had the comment that stuck with me. "This tastes like comfort food that happens to be sophisticated, rather than sophisticated food trying to be comforting. That's a crucial distinction." I was safe again, but the feedback highlighted something I'd been struggling with throughout the competition: the balance between authenticity and ambition. I was comfortable cooking food that made people happy, but translating that philosophy to a high-pressure competition environment was proving more difficult than I'd anticipated. The third challenge changed everything. We had to cater a dinner party for food industry professionals, critics, restaurateurs, and celebrity chefs who would be evaluating our dishes alongside the regular judges. The twist was that we had to work in teams of 3, with one person designated as the executive chef for each team. I was paired with Ashley Thompson from Austin and David Moreau from Miami, both of whom had more experience with fine dining than I did. When we were told to select our executive chef, there was an awkward moment where none of us wanted to step forward. Leadership in a kitchen requires a different skill set than individual cooking, and the wrong decision could send all 3 of us home. "I'll do it," I said, surprising myself as much as my teammates. The menu I designed played to each of our strengths while maintaining a cohesive theme. Ashley would handle the appetizer, a deconstructed Caesar salad that showcased her farm-to-table philosophy. David would prepare the fish course, utilizing his seafood expertise. I would take responsibility for the meat course and dessert, plus coordinate the overall execution. The protein I chose was lamb, specifically a rack of lamb with a Mediterranean-inspired crust, served with roasted vegetables and a yogurt-based sauce that incorporated Middle Eastern flavors. For dessert, I planned a chocolate tart with coffee ice cream and candied nuts. Sophisticated but not overly complex given our time constraints. Coordination proved to be the biggest challenge. 3 talented chefs accustomed to running their own kitchens suddenly had to function as a unified team, sharing equipment, coordinating timing, and trusting each other with components of dishes that would ultimately reflect on all of us. Ashley's Caesar salad was brilliant. She'd transformed the familiar flavors into an elegant composed dish that looked like modern art, but tasted like the best version of something you'd order at a neighborhood bistro. David's fish course was technically flawless, a piece of halibut cooked to perfection with a sauce that enhanced rather than masked the natural flavors. My lamb course was where everything came together or fell apart. The meat was perfectly cooked, the vegetables were seasoned properly, and the sauce had the right balance of tangy and rich. But with 10 minutes left, I realized that the portion sizes were inconsistent and the plating looked amateur compared to the sophistication of the other courses. David jumped in without being asked, helping me standardize the presentations while Ashley coordinated with the front-of-house staff to ensure proper timing. It was the kind of seamless teamwork that only happens when everyone checks their ego and focuses on the collective goal. The dinner service was flawless from the diner's perspective, but in the kitchen, we knew how close we'd come to disaster. The lamb had been touch and go, the dessert plating had been rushed, and we'd run out of one of the sauce components with 3 plates still to go. The critique that night was the most intense of the competition so far. The industry professionals joined the regular judges, and their feedback was brutally honest in the way that only comes from peers who understand exactly how difficult what we'd just accomplished actually was. "The menu was ambitious but cohesive," said one of the guest critics. "Each course felt like part of a planned progression rather than 3 separate dishes. The execution was impressive given the time constraints," added another. "But there were small inconsistencies that suggest the team was pushed to their limits." Chef Rodriguez had the final word. Jessica, you stepped up as a leader when your team needed one. That takes courage. But leadership in a kitchen isn't just about making decisions, it's about executing them flawlessly under pressure. Our team was safe, barely, but the experience had taught me something crucial about my own capabilities. I could handle the pressure of leadership, make decisions quickly when needed, and coordinate complex operations under impossible time constraints. These weren't skills I'd known I possessed, and discovering them in the middle of a televised competition was both exhilarating and terrifying. The fourth challenge was individual again. Create a dish that represented our personal culinary journey. This was exactly the kind of open-ended prompt that either inspired greatness or paralyzed chefs with too many options. I decided to make a dish that told the story of my evolution as a chef, starting with the comfort food foundations my family had given me, incorporating the technical skills I'd learned in culinary school and fine dining restaurants, and finishing with the creative confidence I'd developed at my own restaurant. The dish was a deconstructed pot roast, the meat slow-cooked with traditional vegetables and aromatics, but then composed on the plate in a way that elevated the humble ingredients into something that belonged in a fine dining restaurant. The sauce was the braising liquid reduced and refined, the vegetables were turned and glazed to perfection, and the starch component was a potato gratin that incorporated some of the cooking liquid for deeper flavor. Technically, it wasn't the most complex dish I could have made, but it was honest, and honesty had been the thread running through every success I'd had in my career. The judges tasted it in silence, their expressions unreadable. Chef Foster was the first to speak. This is comfort food for adults. It's familiar enough to be nostalgic, but sophisticated enough to be memorable. Chef Kim nodded in agreement. I can taste your story in this dish. It feels personal in a way that transcends technique. Chef Rodriguez had the comment that made my eyes water. This is the dish of someone who's found their voice as a chef. It's confident without being arrogant, creative without being gimmicky. I was not only safe, I won the challenge, earning immunity for the next elimination and a $5,000 prize that I immediately started planning to invest back into the restaurant. But more importantly, I'd proven something to myself. After years of questioning whether I belonged among serious chefs, I'd just outcooked some of the most talented people in my generation, using nothing more than honesty, technique, and the confidence to trust my own instincts. Standing in that television kitchen, surrounded by cameras and competitors and judges whose approval I'd once thought was the ultimate validation, I realized that the most important approval had already been earned, my own. The aftermath of winning Culinary Masters was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd expected a gradual increase in business, maybe some industry recognition, and hopefully enough momentum to expand the restaurant. What I got instead was a tsunami of attention that threatened to wash away everything I'd carefully built. The show aired on a Thursday night in March, and by Friday morning, my phone was ringing nonstop. Food bloggers, magazine writers, television, producers, and cookbook agents all wanted a piece of the story. The restaurant's reservation line was jammed, our website crashed from traffic, and Sarah was fielding interview requests from media outlets I'd only dreamed of being mentioned in. The most surreal call came from a producer at the Food Network, offering me my own cooking show. "We love your story," she said. "The journey from self-doubt to national champion. America loves an underdog, and you're exactly the kind of chef we want to work with." It was flattering and terrifying in equal measure. A television show would mean financial security, national recognition, and the kind of platform that could launch cookbooks, product lines, and restaurant empires. It would also mean spending months away from Chicago, turning my life into content, and potentially losing the intimate connection with food that had made the restaurant successful in the first place. I told her I needed time to think, but the decision was already forming in my mind. I'd seen too many chefs lose themselves in the machinery of celebrity, trading their authentic voice for broader appeal. The restaurant was my real laboratory, the place where I could continue growing as a chef without having to explain every decision to network executives. The immediate challenge was managing the increased demand without compromising quality. We went from serving 50 covers a night to having a waiting list that stretched 3 months out. I had to make a choice: expand rapidly to accommodate the demand, or maintain our size and risk, disappointing the flood of new customers who wanted to experience what they'd seen on television. I chose to stay small, but smarter. We implemented a more sophisticated reservation system, hired additional staff to handle the increased volume during our existing service hours, and started offering more structured tasting menus that allowed us to control costs and maintain consistency. The hardest part was dealing with the changed expectations. Customers who'd seen me win a national competition arrived expecting something grander than our modest neighborhood restaurant. Some were disappointed by the casual atmosphere, the limited seating, or the fact that I wasn't personally cooking every dish that left the kitchen. One particularly brutal review on Yelp captured the disconnect. Expected fine dining after seeing her win on TV, but this is just elevated bar food in a converted bakery. Totally overhyped. The criticism stung, partly because it echoed my old insecurities about not being sophisticated enough, but mostly because it missed the point entirely. I hadn't opened Crossroads to impress food critics or television audiences. I'd opened it to serve food that made people happy, in an atmosphere where they felt welcome rather than intimidated. Elena became my voice of reason during this chaotic period. "We knew this would happen," she reminded me during a particularly stressful prep session. "The question is whether we're going to change who we are to meet other people's expectations or stay true to what got us here." She was right, but staying true to our identity while managing unprecedented demand required constant vigilance. Every new hire, every menu change, every operational decision had to be filtered through the question of whether it served our core mission or just accommodated our newfound popularity. The real test came when Michelin announced they were expanding their guide to include Chicago restaurants. The prospect of earning a Michelin star was both thrilling and terrifying. Stars could validate everything I'd worked toward, but they could also trap me in a pursuit of external validation that had already caused me so much trouble earlier in my career. The inspection happened on a Tuesday night in October, almost exactly a year after the show had aired. I didn't know the inspector was there until Sarah mentioned a customer at table 8 who'd been taking unusually detailed notes about everything from the service timing to the ingredient sourcing. I cooked that night with particular attention to detail. Not because I was trying to impress an anonymous critic, but because the possibility of recognition reminded me why precision mattered. Every sauce was tasted multiple times, every plate was inspected before leaving the pass, and every interaction with the dining room was choreographed to reflect our values of hospitality and care. The inspector ordered a cross-section of our menu: the Korean short rib grilled cheese that had become our signature, the seasonal tasting menu that showcased our range, and several dishes from our regular menu that represented our everyday cooking. He ate methodically, spoke little to the server, and left without any indication of his verdict. 3 months later, Sarah called me at home on a Sunday morning, her voice shaking with excitement. "We got it. We got the star." The Michelin announcement cited our innovative approach to comfort food, exceptional consistency, and genuine hospitality that makes fine dining accessible. More importantly, the review captured exactly what I'd been trying to achieve. Chef Martinez has created something rare: a restaurant that respects both tradition and innovation, serving food that satisfies both the stomach and the soul. The star brought another wave of attention, but this time I was better prepared. We'd learned to manage demand, maintain quality, and stay true to our identity regardless of external pressure. More importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what constituted success. The most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the Michelin announcement, my mom called with news that surprised me more than any award or review. "I've been cooking," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. Really cooking, not just following recipes. I made that soup you served us on the show, the one based on my chicken noodle. It took me 6 tries to get it right. She'd been experimenting with techniques she'd learned from watching my television appearances, trying to understand the principles behind the dishes rather than just following instructions. More importantly, she'd been sharing her newfound enthusiasm with her friends, hosting dinner parties where she attempted ambitious menus and actually enjoyed the process of cooking. "I never understood before," she continued, "that cooking could be creative and expressive. I thought it was just about getting food on the table. But watching you, seeing how you think about flavors and textures and presentation, it made me realize I'd been missing the whole point." This conversation meant more to me than any professional recognition. My mother, who'd spent decades viewing cooking as a chore, had discovered the joy and creativity that had driven my entire career. The fact that my success had inspired her to find her own culinary voice felt like the completion of a circle that had started with her well-intentioned criticism years earlier. The success also opened doors I'd never expected to walk through. Publishers approached me about cookbooks, other chefs invited me to collaboration dinners, and culinary schools asked me to speak to their students about building a career in food. The cookbook project intrigued me most. Working with a publisher allowed me to document not just recipes, but the philosophy behind them, the idea that good cooking comes from understanding ingredients, respecting techniques, and having the confidence to trust your own palate. The tea book, which we titled Crossroads, Where Comfort Meets Craft, became a way to share the lessons I'd learned about finding authenticity in an industry that often rewards conformity. Each recipe was accompanied by stories about its development, explanations of the techniques involved, and encouragement for home cooks to adapt and experiment rather than just follow instructions blindly. Writing the cookbook also forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to express, that the best food comes from a place of generosity rather than ego. Every dish should be a gift to the person eating it, a way of saying, "I care about your experience and want to make it better." This philosophy extended beyond the restaurant to my approach to mentoring young cooks. I started hosting stages, unpaid stages where aspiring chefs could spend a few days learning our methods and philosophy. Unlike the brutal apprenticeships I'd endured at places like Meridian, our stages focused on teaching principles rather than breaking spirits. Danny Walsh, my former sous chef, returned from his stage in New York with skills that had been sharpened by adversity and a new appreciation for the collaborative approach we'd developed at Crossroads. Watching him grow from an enthusiastic but inconsistent cook into a confident professional reminded me why I'd gotten into this business in the first place. The second anniversary of the restaurant coincided with the publication of the cookbook, and we decided to celebrate with a special dinner that showcased our evolution. The menu included dishes from our original opening, refined versions of television competition recipes, and new creations that represented where we were heading. My parents flew in for the celebration, along with Elena's family, Sarah's parents, and several of the customers who'd been with us since the beginning. The dining room was full of people who'd supported our journey at different stages, from the neighborhood regulars who'd taken a chance on an unknown restaurant to the industry professionals who'd helped validate our approach. During the dinner, I took a moment to step back and observe the scene, the buzz of conversation, the satisfied expressions of diners experiencing food they'd never tasted before, the seamless service that came from a team working in harmony. This was what success looked like, not the television appearances or awards, but the simple act of making people happy through food. My mom found me during a quiet moment in the kitchen, where I was putting finishing touches on the final course. "Have something to tell you," she said, and her tone suggested this was important. "I've been watching Culinary Masters reruns, the episodes with you, and I finally understand what you were trying to do all those years. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You weren't just learning to cook. You were learning to speak a language I didn't understand. And when I called your food bland and basic, I wasn't criticizing your cooking. I was admitting that I couldn't hear what you were trying to say. This insight crystallized something I'd been grappling with throughout my career. Food is indeed a language, and like any language, it requires both speakers and listeners who understand its vocabulary. My journey hadn't just been about finding my voice as a chef. It had been about finding an audience that could appreciate the nuances of what I was trying to communicate. As the evening wound down and the last customers filtered out into the Chicago night, I realized that this moment, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues in the restaurant I'd built from scratch, represented the real victory. Not the television win, not the Michelin star, not the cookbook deal, but the quiet satisfaction of having created something meaningful that brought people together over shared experience. The scared line cook who'd quit her job at Meridian 5 years earlier could never have imagined this scene. But she'd been necessary too, because without that moment of acknowledging failure and starting over, none of this would have been possible. Sometimes the most important ingredient in any recipe is the courage to begin again. 2 years after the Michelin star, an unexpected phone call changed everything again. I was in the middle of prep for dinner service when Sarah handed me the phone with an expression that meant either extraordinary news or complete disaster. Jessica Martinez? The voice was professional, confident, with a slight New York accent. This is Victoria Chen from the James Beard Foundation. Do you have a few minutes to talk? The James Beard Awards, often called the Oscars of the food world, represented the highest level of recognition in American cuisine. Being nominated was career-defining. Winning was legendary. I'd watched the ceremony on television for years, dreaming of the day I might be considered worthy of such recognition. We're calling to inform you that you've been nominated for Outstanding Chef, Victoria continued. The ceremony is in June, and we'd love to have you attend. Outstanding Chef, not Rising Chef, not Best Chef. Midwest, but Outstanding Chef. The award given to the single most exceptional chef in the entire country. I was competing against culinary legends, chefs whose names were synonymous with American fine dining, people who'd been shaping the industry since before I'd graduated culinary school. The nomination alone was validation beyond anything I'd imagined, but it also brought pressure I wasn't prepared for. Suddenly, every food publication wanted to profile the small-town chef taking on the culinary establishment. My quiet neighborhood restaurant became a pilgrimage site for industry professionals and food tourists from around the world. The increased scrutiny was exhausting. Food critics arrived with preconceptions based on my television appearance and Michelin star, expecting either revolutionary innovations or profound disappointments. Some loved the unpretentious atmosphere and focus on hospitality. Others seemed disappointed that I wasn't pushing more boundaries or showcasing more technical virtuosity. A particularly harsh review in Eater criticized what the writer called my comfortable mediocrity, arguing that I'd chosen accessibility over ambition and that my nomination represented the dumbing down of American cuisine. The critique stung because it echoed every doubt I'd ever had about my own capabilities. Elena found me that night sitting alone in the empty dining room, reading the review for the 3rd time. You know what your problem is? She said, taking the phone from my hands. You still care too much about what other people think. You built this place because you had something to say. Don't let other people's opinions make you forget what that was. She was right, but the pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced. The James Beard ceremony was 6 weeks away, and every service felt like an audition for judges who weren't, even in the room. I found myself second-guessing decisions that had become instinctive, overthinking dishes that had been perfected through months of refinement. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal Saturday night service. We were completely booked, with a waiting list of industry VIPs who'd flown in specifically to evaluate my cooking before the awards ceremony. I was working the pass with the intensity of someone trying to prove something, tasting every sauce multiple times, rejecting plates for microscopic flaws that nobody else would notice. Halfway through service, I sent back a perfectly good lamb dish because the sauce wasn't distributed with mathematical precision across the plate. Danny, who'd become my most trusted cook, looked at me with concern. "Chef, that plate was perfect. What's wrong?" What was wrong was that I'd fallen back into the trap of cooking for critics instead of cooking for people. I was so focused on impressing judges and reviewers that I'd forgotten the fundamental lesson that had made the restaurant successful. Good food comes from a place of generosity, not anxiety. I called a brief kitchen meeting and reminded the team of our core philosophy. We weren't trying to reinvent cuisine or prove our technical superiority. We were trying to make people happy through food that was both sophisticated and soulful. The critics and judges would have to evaluate us on those terms. The rest of the service flowed with the natural rhythm we'd developed over years of working together. Dishes left the kitchen when they were ready, not when they were perfect, according to some arbitrary standard. The dining room buzzed with the conversation and laughter that indicated customers were having experiences rather than just eating meals. 3 weeks before the James Beard ceremony, I received another unexpected call, this one from a familiar voice. "Jessica, it's Rebecca Santos, from the Tribune. I'm working on a feature about your nomination, and I wanted to ask you something that's been bothering me since I first reviewed your restaurant. I braced myself for criticism or probing questions about my worthiness for such prestigious recognition. Why haven't you opened a second location? With your success, the demand clearly exists. Most chefs in your position would have expanded by now." The question caught me off guard because I'd been wrestling with the same issue. Investors had approached me about opening Crossroads locations in other cities. Restaurant groups had offered partnerships that would allow rapid expansion while maintaining creative control. The financial projections were compelling, the market research was encouraging, and the business logic was sound. But every time I seriously considered expansion, I remembered why I'd opened the restaurant in the first place. It wasn't to build an empire or maximize profits. It was to create a specific experience in a specific place for a specific community. Pilsen wasn't just the neighborhood where my restaurant happened to be located. It was integral to our identity. "I don't want to be bigger," I told Rebecca. "I want to be better. There's a difference." This philosophy had shaped every major decision since opening. Instead of expanding horizontally, we deepened our commitment to our existing customers and community. We developed relationships with local farmers and producers, created a wine program that showcased small vintners, and built a staff culture that prioritized career development over rapid turnover. The approach was unconventional in an industry that measured success through expansion and revenue growth, but it had allowed us to maintain the intimacy and attention to detail that made the restaurant special. I could still personally taste every sauce, know every regular customer's preferences, and ensure that our values were reflected in every aspect of the operation. The James Beard ceremony took place at the Lyric Opera of Chicago, a venue grand enough to match the significance of the event. The nominees' dinner the night before was a surreal gathering of culinary legends, chefs whose cookbooks I'd studied in culinary school, whose restaurants had defined American cuisine for decades. I found myself seated next to Thomas Chen, the chef owner of 11 Madison Park, whose restaurant had been ranked #1 in the world. He was gracious and encouraging, but our conversation reinforced how different my path had been from the traditional trajectory of James Beard winners. "Tell me about your restaurant," he said. "I've heard incredible things, but I haven't had a chance to visit Chicago recently." I described Crossroads, the small dining room, the neighborhood location, the focus on comfort food elevated through technique and creativity. As I talked, I realized I was essentially describing everything that conventional wisdom said wouldn't win major culinary awards. That sounds wonderful, Thomas said, and his sincerity was obvious. The industry needs more chefs who prioritize hospitality over headlines. Not everything has to be revolutionary to be exceptional. The ceremony itself was a blur of speeches, presentations, and mounting nervous energy. The Outstanding Chef category was announced near the end of the evening, after I'd watched colleagues and heroes receive recognition for their contributions to American cuisine. When they called my name, the shock was so complete that Sarah had to physically push me toward the stage. The acceptance speech I'd prepared disappeared from my mind, replaced by a jumble of gratitude and disbelief. "This award doesn't belong to me," I managed to say into the microphone. "It belongs to everyone who believed that good food could bring people together, who supported a small restaurant in a changing neighborhood, and who proved that excellence doesn't require choosing between accessibility and ambition." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of my individual achievement. It was validation of an approach to cooking that prioritized community over celebrity, substance over spectacle. The aftermath of winning the James Beard Award was different from the post-television attention. The recognition was more meaningful. To industry professionals, leading to opportunities for collaboration rather than just increased business. Chefs I admired reached out about joint dinners, culinary schools invited me to teach master classes, and food publications asked for my perspective on industry trends rather than just profiling my personal story. The most significant opportunity came from an unexpected source. The Culinary Institute of America, the most prestigious cooking school in the country, offered me a position developing their curriculum around hospitality and restaurant operations. It would mean spending 1 week each month in New York, working with the next generation of chefs to understand that technical skill was just one component of culinary success. Teaching forced me to articulate principles I'd been operating on, instinctively. How do you balance creativity with consistency? How do you build a team culture that prioritizes growth over competition? How do you stay true to your vision while adapting to changing circumstances? The students were eager and talented, but many struggled with the same insecurities I'd battled throughout my career. They'd been trained to believe that cooking was about impressing critics and peers rather than serving guests. My role became helping them understand that confidence in the kitchen came from clarity of purpose, not complexity of technique. One student, a young woman named Maria Santos, reminded me of myself at that age. Technically proficient but creatively constrained by fear of making mistakes. During a practical exam where students had to create an original dish, she presented something that was flawlessly executed but completely forgettable. "What were you trying to say with this dish?" I asked her during the critique. She looked confused. "I was trying to show that I could balance flavors and textures properly." "But what were you trying to communicate? What experience did you want the person eating this to have?" The concept was foreign to her, as it had been to me for years. She'd been taught to cook correctly, but not to cook meaningfully. We spent the next hour talking about the difference between technical proficiency and creative expression, about how the best dishes told stories that connected with people on an emotional level. By the end of the semester, Maria had developed her own voice, dishes that reflected her Mexican heritage filtered through classical French training, food that was both personal and universal. Watching her transformation reminded me why teaching had become so rewarding. The success also allowed me to give back to the Chicago food community that had supported my journey. I started a scholarship program for aspiring chefs from underrepresented backgrounds, providing funding for culinary education along with mentorship and stage opportunities at Crossroads. The scholarship recipients brought fresh perspectives and energy to our kitchen, while learning the principles of hospitality-focused cooking that had defined our approach. Many went on to important positions at other restaurants throughout the city, carrying with them the values we'd tried to instill. 5 years after winning the James Beard Award, I found myself in a position I'd never imagined, recognized as one of the most influential chefs in America, but still cooking in the same small restaurant where my career had truly begun. The industry had changed dramatically during that time. Social media had transformed how restaurants marketed themselves, food delivery apps had altered consumer expectations, and a global pandemic had forced every chef to reconsider fundamental assumptions about hospitality and service. Through all these changes, Crossroads had remained constant, a neighborhood restaurant that happened to serve exceptional food, rather than an exceptional restaurant that happened to be in a neighborhood. The consistency of our mission had become our greatest strength, allowing us to adapt to external changes without losing our identity. My relationship with my mother had evolved into something I'd never expected, a genuine collaboration. She'd become an accomplished home cook in her own right, developing recipes that bridged our generational divide. We'd even discussed writing a cookbook together, Mothers and Daughters, How Food Connects Generations, that would explore how culinary traditions evolve and adapt across families. The scared young cook who'd quit her job at Meridian a decade earlier could never have imagined this outcome. But that person had been necessary too, because without that moment of admitting failure and starting over, none of the subsequent success would have been possible. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, watching Elena train a new cook in the same patient way she'd once trained me, I realized that the greatest achievement wasn't the awards or recognition. It was the creation of something sustainable that would outlast my individual involvement. Restaurant had become bigger than any one person, including its founder, and perhaps that was the most meaningful measure of success. Building something that could continue making people happy long after you'd moved on to whatever came next. The call came on a snowy February morning, 3 years after the James Beard Award. I was reviewing invoices in my office when Sarah knocked on the door with an expression I'd learned to recognize, the look of someone delivering news that would change everything. "There's someone from the White House on the phone," she said, and I assumed she was joking until I saw the caller ID display. Margaret Foster, director of White House events, explained that they were planning a state dinner for the Prime Minister of Canada, and they wanted to feature American chefs who represented innovation in regional cuisine. My name had come up repeatedly during their selection process. "We'd like you to collaborate with 3 other chefs to create a menu that showcases the diversity and excellence of American cooking," she said. "It would be an honor to have you represent the Midwest." Cooking at the White House was the kind of opportunity that transcended individual achievement. It was about representing American cuisine on the world stage. The other selected chefs were legends in their own right. Anthony Martinez from San Francisco, whose modern Mexican cuisine had redefined California cooking. Sarah Johnson from Charleston, who'd become the definitive voice of contemporary Southern food. And Michael Chen from Portland, whose farm-to-table philosophy had influenced a generation of chefs. The planning process took 3 months and involved more security clearances, background checks, and protocol briefings than I'd experienced, even during my most intensive television appearances. Every ingredient had to be pre-approved, every technique had to be documented, and every aspect of the menu had to be balanced for diplomatic considerations as well as culinary excellence. The theme we developed was American Crossroads, dishes, that reflected the cultural intersections that had shaped American cuisine. My contribution was a refined version of the Korean short rib dish that had become my signature, but elevated for the formal setting and adapted to accommodate the diverse dietary restrictions of international diplomats. Working alongside the other chefs was intimidating at first. These were people whose restaurants I'd admired for years, whose cookbooks had influenced my own development, whose techniques I'd studied and adapted. But the collaboration revealed something important about the current state of American cuisine. We were all grappling with similar questions about authenticity, innovation, and representation. Anthony's modern Mexican food faced constant criticism about cultural appropriation, despite his own Mexican heritage. Sarah dealt with the burden of representing Southern cuisine while acknowledging its complicated historical associations. Michael navigated the challenge of promoting local ingredients while running restaurants that relied on global supply chains. Our conversations during the prep week revealed how much the industry had matured beyond the celebrity chef culture that had dominated the previous decade. We were all more interested in building sustainable businesses and mentoring the next generation than in personal recognition or media attention. The state dinner itself was held in the East Room, with a guest list that included diplomats, business leaders, and cultural figures from both countries. Serving my food to the president, the prime minister, and their guests felt surreal. But the real satisfaction came from watching career service staff, many of whom had worked White House events for decades, taste our dishes with genuine appreciation. Tuishio. Evening's success led to an unexpected consequence, a flood of international opportunities. Restaurants in London, Tokyo, and Sydney invited me for collaboration dinners. Food festivals around the world extended speaking invitations. Culinary schools in Europe asked me to conduct masterclasses on American regional cuisine. The most intriguing offer came from Toronto, where a hospitality group wanted to open an American comfort food restaurant and thought I'd be the perfect consulting chef. The financial terms were generous, the creative freedom was extensive, and the opportunity to influence Canadian dining culture was appealing. But after a week of consideration, I declined. The success of Crossroads had always been rooted in its connection to Pilsen, to Chicago, to the specific community we served. Replicating that magic in a different country, with different ingredients and different cultural context, felt like missing the point entirely. Instead, I decided to use the international attention to shine a spotlight on Chicago's broader food scene. I organized a series of collaboration dinners that paired Crossroads with other local restaurants, showcasing the diversity and innovation that had made the city a culinary destination. These events became quarterly traditions, each focused on a different aspect of Chicago's food culture. We did a dinner highlighting the city's immigrant communities, featuring dishes that represented the Korean, Mexican, Polish, and Italian influences that had shaped local cuisine. Another event showcased young chefs who were pushing boundaries while respecting traditions. The collaboration dinners also became fundraisers for local food banks and culinary education programs. The success of the restaurant had given me resources and influence that came with responsibility to support the broader community that had made our success possible. During this period, my mother's role in my life evolved in ways I'd never anticipated. Her newfound passion for cooking had grown into genuine expertise, and she'd started teaching cooking classes at the community college in Portland. Her approach was different from mine, more practical, more focused on helping home cooks build confidence, but equally valid. She called one evening with news that surprised me more than any award or recognition I'd received. "I've been offered a cookbook deal," she said, and I could hear the excitement and nervousness in her voice. "They want me to write about cooking for families, practical techniques that make weeknight dinners more interesting." The irony was perfect. The woman who'd once dismissed my cooking as bland and basic was now being recognized for her own culinary expertise. But more than ironic, it was deeply satisfying. Our different approaches to food had both found their audiences, proving that there wasn't just one way to be successful in the culinary world. I offered to write the foreword for her book, and she accepted with tears in her eyes. The piece I wrote became one of the most personal things I'd ever published, exploring our complicated relationship with food and each other, and how criticism delivered with love could ultimately become the foundation for growth. "My mother taught me that cooking was about taking care of people," I wrote. "It took me years to understand that her criticism of my food was another way of taking care of me, protecting me from failure by encouraging me to try harder. What she didn't realize was that failure was exactly what I needed to find my own voice." The cookbook, titled Sunday Dinners and Weeknight Wins: A Mother's Guide to Family Cooking, became a bestseller in the practical cooking category, More importantly, it established my mother as a credible voice in food education, someone who understood that not everyone needed to cook at restaurant level to create meaningful meals for their families. Around this time, I started thinking seriously about the restaurant's future beyond my own involvement. Crossroads was approaching its 10th anniversary, and while the business was thriving, I was increasingly interested in projects that had broader impact: teaching, writing, mentoring, and advocating for positive change in the industry. Elena had evolved into much more than a sous chef. She was effectively running day-to-day operations and had developed her own following among regular customers. Her leadership style was different from mine, more systematic, more focused on efficiency, but equally effective at maintaining the quality and culture that had made the restaurant successful. We began discussing a transition plan that would allow me to step back from daily operations while ensuring the restaurant's continued success. The process was complicated by my attachment to the place that had defined my career, but also by the practical considerations of business ownership and staff continuity. The solution we developed was unconventional. Instead of selling the restaurant, or stepping away completely, I would gradually transfer operational control to Elena while maintaining ownership and creative oversight. This arrangement would allow her to put her own stamp on the operation while preserving the core values that had made it successful. The announcement of this transition coincided with another unexpected opportunity. The Culinary Institute of America offered me the position of Dean of Restaurant Operations, overseeing all aspects of their hands-on training programs. It would mean relocating to New York for part of each year, but it also represented the chance to influence culinary education at the highest level. The role appealed to me because it addressed many of the industry problems I'd witnessed throughout my career. Too many culinary schools focused exclusively on technical training while ignoring the business, leadership, and hospitality skills that determined whether restaurants actually succeeded. Students graduated with impressive knife skills but no understanding of cost control, staff management, or customer service. My vision for the program emphasized the holistic nature of restaurant success. Students would still learn classical techniques and contemporary trends, but they'd also study financial management, human resources, marketing, and the psychological aspects of hospitality. They'd work in real restaurants, dealing with actual customers and genuine pressure rather than just practicing in controlled classroom environments. The pilot program launched with 30 students who'd been selected for their combination of technical skill and leadership potential. The curriculum was demanding, combining intensive kitchen training with business school-level coursework and extensive externships at carefully selected restaurants. The results exceeded my expectations. Graduates of the program were immediately successful in management positions, launching their own restaurants, and becoming influential voices in their local food scenes. More importantly, they carried with them a philosophy of cooking that prioritized hospitality and community over personal recognition. One graduate, James Rodriguez, opened a small restaurant in Detroit that became a catalyst for neighborhood revitalization. Another, Emily Park, developed a catering company that specialized in making high-quality food accessible to underserved communities. A third, David Kim, became head chef at a major hospital system, revolutionizing institutional food service to focus on nutrition and flavor rather than just cost control. Watching these young chefs succeed using principles we'd developed together was more satisfying than any personal achievement. It suggested that the lessons I'd learned, often through painful trial and error, could be systematized and transmitted to others, potentially changing how the entire industry approached the relationship between cooking and hospitality. The 10th anniversary celebration of Crossroads became a reflection on everything that had changed, both in my personal journey and in the broader food world. The event brought together people from every phase of my career: former colleagues from my line cook days, fellow contestants from Culinary Masters, students from the CIA program, and customers who'd been supporting the restaurant since its early days. My parents were there, of course, looking proud and slightly overwhelmed by the crowd of food industry luminaries who'd traveled to Chicago for the celebration. My mother gave a speech that evening, talking about how the restaurant had taught her to see cooking as an art form rather than just a domestic chore. "I spent years trying to protect my daughter from disappointment," she said to the packed dining room. What I didn't understand was that disappointment is often the first step towards something beautiful. This restaurant, this community, this celebration, none of it would exist if she hadn't been brave enough to fail first. The evening felt like both an ending and a beginning. Crossroads would continue under Elena's leadership, carrying forward the values we'd developed while evolving to reflect her own vision. My role would shift toward education and mentoring, focusing on the next generation of chefs and restaurateurs. Standing in the dining room that night, surrounded by the evidence of what could be accomplished when talent met opportunity and persistence, I realized that the scared young cook who'd once questioned her own abilities had become someone who helped others find their confidence. The journey from bland and basic to James Beard Award winner hadn't been about proving my critics wrong. It had been about learning to trust my own judgment, to cook with authenticity rather than anxiety, and to understand that the best food comes from a desire to make people happy rather than to impress them. But perhaps most importantly, it had been about discovering that success in the culinary world wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about building something sustainable that could outlast any single person's involvement, creating opportunities for others, and contributing to a food culture that valued substance over spectacle. The restaurant would continue. The students would graduate and open their own places. The industry would keep evolving. And somewhere, perhaps, another young cook struggling with self-doubt would find inspiration to keep trying, to trust their instincts, and to discover their own authentic voice. 5 years later, I stood in the green room of a television studio in Los Angeles, adjusting my chef's coat one final time before what would be my last appearance on Culinary Masters, not as a contestant this time, but as a guest judge for the finale of their 20th season. The irony wasn't lost on me. The show that had launched my national career was now seeking my expertise to evaluate the next generation of rising chefs. The scared contestant who'd once questioned whether she belonged in that kitchen had become someone whose opinion helped determine other people's futures. Through the monitor, I could see the final 3 contestants putting the finishing touches on their signature dishes. Each one reminded me of myself at different stages of my journey. The technically perfect but emotionally distant cook, the creative innovator struggling with consistency, and the confident chef who'd found their authentic voice but still needed validation. During a commercial break, I called Elena at Crossroads. It was Friday night in Chicago, which meant the restaurant would be hitting its peak service stride. "How's everything going?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Under Elena's leadership, the restaurant had not only maintained its reputation, but had evolved into something even more special. A true neighborhood institution that happened to serve world-class food. "Booked solid, as usual," she replied, and I could hear the familiar sounds of a busy kitchen in the background. "We had a table of James Beard winners tonight, and they specifically asked me to thank you for mentoring Elena. Apparently, her leadership style is becoming legendary in the industry." The pride in Elena's voice was unmistakable, and it reflected something I'd learned about true success in the restaurant business. The greatest achievement wasn't creating a place that couldn't function without you, but building something so strong that it could thrive and grow in your absence. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts as she appeared beside me in the green room. At 73, she'd become something of a celebrity in her own right. Her cookbook had spawned a PBS cooking show called Mom's Kitchen Wisdom, where she taught practical techniques to home cooks who wanted to improve their weeknight dinners without intimidating themselves. "Are you nervous?" she asked, straightening my collar in the way mothers never stop doing, regardless of their children's ages or accomplishments. "Not nervous," I replied. "Just reflective." We'd both come so far from that evening in my cramped Chicago apartment when she'd dismissed my pasta primavera as bland and basic. Her criticism, delivered with the protective instincts of a worried mother, had inadvertently set me on a path that led to everything I'd accomplished since. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about that night when I criticized your cooking." I was so wrong, but also maybe accidentally right. I looked at her with curiosity. "Your cooking wasn't bland and basic," she continued, "but you were cooking like you thought it should be. You weren't trusting yourself yet." Sometimes the harshest criticism comes exactly when we need to stop seeking approval and start seeking authenticity. The production assistant called for judges to take their positions, interrupting our conversation, but not its significance. My mother's insight captured something profound about the creative process: that external criticism often reveals internal doubt, and that the journey to finding your voice requires learning when to listen to others and when to trust yourself. Walking onto the set, I thought about the 3 young chefs who were about to receive critiques that could shape their careers. Each dish they'd prepared told a story about their training, their influences, their hopes for the future. My job wasn't to impose my own preferences, but to help them understand whether their cooking was communicating what they intended. The first contestant, Maria Santos, coincidentally sharing a name with my former student, had prepared a dish that was technically flawless but emotionally reserved. Her background was similar to mine: classical training, years in high-end kitchens, and a tendency to let perfectionism overshadow personality. "Tell me about this dish," I said, tasting the beautifully composed plate in front of me. "It's duck breast with cherry gastrique, roasted vegetables, and potato fondant," she replied, using the kind of precise culinary language that sounded impressive but revealed nothing about intention. "But why this dish? What made you choose these flavors, these techniques?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, just as similar questions had once confused me. She'd been trained to execute dishes correctly, but not to cook meaningfully. I wanted to show my technical skills," she said hesitantly. "Your technical skills are obvious," I replied gently. "But what I'm not tasting is you. This could have been prepared by any competent chef with access to the same ingredients. Where's Maria in this dish?" The critique wasn't harsh, but it was honest. I could see the recognition in her eyes. The same moment of realization I'd experienced years earlier when I understood that cooking without personal voice was just expensive meal preparation. The second contestant had prepared something more ambitious: a deconstructed soup that challenged conventional presentations while maintaining familiar flavors. It was creative and well executed, but the innovation felt forced, as if he'd prioritized being different over being delicious. The third contestant's dish was the most interesting: a simple preparation of local fish with seasonal vegetables, but executed with the kind of confidence that comes from understanding ingredients rather than trying to impress judges. It was the kind of cooking I'd learned to value most: sophisticated in its simplicity, creative in its restraint. After the tasting, during the judges' deliberation, I found myself advocating for the third contestant, not because their dish was the most technically complex, but because it demonstrated the hardest skill to teach: the confidence to let great ingredients speak for themselves. "This chef understands that cooking is a conversation, not a monologue," I explained to my fellow judges. "The dish shows respect for the ingredients, understanding of technique, and most importantly, it tastes like someone made it for people they care about." When we announced the winner, the young chef whose simple fish dish had told the most compelling story, I saw something in their face that reminded me of my own moment of victory years earlier. It wasn't just pride in winning a competition. It was validation that their approach to cooking had value, that authenticity could triumph over complexity. After the filming wrapped, I had dinner with the show's producers, reflecting on how the program had evolved since my own appearance. The focus had shifted from pure technical challenges to a more holistic evaluation of cooking ability, including leadership, creativity, and the elusive quality of making food that actually mattered to people eating it. "You changed the show," one producer told me. "After your season, we realized we were rewarding the wrong things. Technical skill is important, but it's not everything." Flying back to Chicago the next morning, I thought about the trajectory that had brought me to this point. The young line cook who'd once questioned every decision had become someone whose judgment was sought by television producers, culinary schools, and aspiring chefs around the country. But the real measure of success wasn't the external recognition. It was the quiet satisfaction of having contributed to a food culture that valued substance over spectacle, hospitality over ego, and authenticity over artifice. Crossroads was thriving under Elena's leadership. My students were opening successful restaurants across the country, and my mother had found her own voice in the culinary world. The ripple effects of taking that first risk, quitting a stable job to open a small restaurant in a changing neighborhood, continued expanding in ways I'd never anticipated. That evening, I sat in the same corner booth where my mother had first tasted my cooking with genuine appreciation, reviewing applications for the next class of students in the CIA program. Each applicant represented someone at the beginning of their own journey, facing the same fundamental questions I'd grappled with. How do you find your authentic voice? How do you balance creativity with consistency? How do you build something sustainable that serves others rather than just satisfying your own ego? The answers weren't simple, and they couldn't be taught through lectures or textbooks. They had to be discovered through experience, through failure, through the slow process of learning to trust your own instincts while remaining open to growth and criticism. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Busy night, but wanted you to." "No, Table 12 specifically asked me to tell you that your Korean short rib grilled cheese changed their life. Some dishes become legends." I smiled, remembering the skepticism that dish had originally faced from critics who thought it was too casual for serious dining. Now it was being taught in culinary schools as an example of how to successfully bridge comfort food and fine dining. Looking around the restaurant that had given me so much, I realized that the greatest lesson I'd learned wasn't about cooking at all. It was about the courage to be authentically yourself, even when others don't immediately understand or appreciate what you're trying to achieve. My mother's criticism, delivered with love but received with pain, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes the most important gift someone can give you is the motivation to prove them wrong, not through anger or resentment, but through the patient work of becoming who you're meant to be. The scared young cook who'd once dismissed her own abilities as bland and basic had discovered something profound, that the most extraordinary achievements often grow from the most ordinary beginnings, and that the journey from self-doubt to self-confidence is the most important recipe anyone can master. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.